My daughter-in-law slid an invoice across the table charging me $4,000 a month to live in the very house my late husband and I once owned outright. My chest tightened, but I didn't break. I folded that paper and let silence guard me. Instead of tearing it up, I tucked it away, knowing proof would one day speak louder than my pain. That was only the first page of a long fight they never expected me to win. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I was rinsing out my coffee mug when I heard the slap of mail against the front door. At 64, I still bent down, slowly, careful with my knees. A thin stack weighted nothing unusual until I saw the envelope with my name typed neatly across it. The paper was thick, heavier than a normal bill. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled it open. Inside lay an official-looking invoice, the kind you'd expect from a landlord or company. My eyes ran over the lines once, then again. Monthly rent due $4,000. At the bottom in Selena's handwriting was a flourish of a signature, my daughter-in-law's. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My own address, the house I'd cleaned for decades, listed as leased property. The very rooms where I raised my son now itemized like a stranger's apartment. I read it again, checking for some mistake. No, it was deliberate, detailed, complete with bank transfer instructions. My fingers trembled and I gripped the counter to steady myself. Confusion fogged my mind first. Was this some joke? Then disbelief settled in the kind that makes your stomach drop as if the ground tilted. By the third reading, heaviness crept into my chest. Celine had reduced my home, my late husband's and mine, to a transaction as if I were just another tenant who owed her. That afternoon, I sat by the window with the invoice flat on my lap. Sunlight caught the ink, each number sharp. My memory drifted back to the day Harold and I signed the deed, proud to call this place ours. Years later, after he passed, I'd tried to honor him by helping Dorian. My boy had been struggling and gifting. The house felt like a way to keep him steady, to keep Harold's spirit alive in the family. I never imagined it would turn against me. Now I worked odd jobs delivering groceries, sewing alterations for neighbors to cover my modest bills. Every mile in the Texas heat pressed on my bones, yet I never complained. Still, no matter how many hours I picked up, I could never have $4,000 lying around. The absurdity bit into me like acid. Pride I once carried, seeing Dorian start his family, curled into regret that gnawed deep. I thought giving the house was love. Celine had turned it into leverage. That evening, as dusk sank over Houston, I climbed the stairs slower than usual. From the hallway, I heard Celine's laughter spilling from the bedroom she shared with Dorian. "We'll need extra champagne," she said between bursts of giggles. A man's voice chimed in from the phone speaker, someone confirming a DJ. My jaw tightened. Later, alone in my room, I scrolled my phone to distract myself. That's when her Instagram story popped up public for the whole world. She had posed in a shimmering dress glass of Dom Perignon, raised high, captioned with glittering emojis, "Life's too short not to celebrate big." Behind her were boxes of imported liquor brand tags, flaunted like trophies. The very money she squeezed from me dressed her in silk. A sharp sting rose in my throat, humiliation cutting deeper than anger. Not only had she billed me, she mocked me indirectly, displaying excess while I wore the same cardigan I'd mended twice. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. I sat at the kitchen table, invoice still on the wood grain before me. My gaze drifted to Harold's photograph on the wall. He had built this house, brick by brick, each overtime shift poured into its foundation. He'd left us a place meant for safety and continuity. Now his sacrifice echoed against walls that shook with bass-heavy music and shallow laughter. The ache in my chest wasn't only for money lost, but for the silence from Dorian. My son hadn't said a word, hadn't defended me. His quiet was louder than Celine's mockery. I tried to remember the boy who once kissed my cheek before school, who asked for help with science projects. Where was that son now? My hands pressed against the table, the memory of Harold's calloused palms flashing through me. Stability had once been our foundation. Now neglect filled its cracks. At midnight, I took the invoice in hand again. The paper was crisp, smelling faintly of toner. For a wild moment, I considered tearing it, shredding each line into nothing. But instead, I folded it neatly, corner to corner, and slipped it into the drawer by my bed. It wasn't submission, it was record. My instinct told me to keep it not as a complaint, but as evidence. Paper could be dismissed by laughter, but ink carried weight. I was tired, yes. Worn, yes. But beneath the fatigue, a cold determination stirred. They thought I would crumble, that I'd accept humiliation quietly. They were half right, I would stay quiet. But quiet is not weakness. Quiet can be armor. I slid the drawer shut, fingers lingering on the wood. Something told me this was only the beginning. I slipped the invoice into the drawer, not knowing yet it would become my first piece of armor. The very next morning, I walked into the kitchen, hoping for a glass of orange juice before heading to my grocery shift. What greeted me wasn't breakfast, but a gleaming silver padlock snapped around the handles of the refrigerator. For a second, I thought my eyes had blurred from sleep, but no, the lock sat firm, cold and deliberate. The fridge hummed quietly behind it, stocked with food I could not touch. My stomach tightened, not from hunger alone, but from the sting of being locked out in my own house. Celine had turned something as ordinary as a fridge into a weapon. I stood there, fingers brushing the lock's metal the way a person might test a wound. The insult hit deeper than words could. Food is life, and she had drawn a line that excluded me. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting Dorian to appear to intervene to undo the lock and restore some dignity. But his door stayed shut. Silence his answer. I swallowed hard heat rising behind my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of that padlock. I made do with what I had in my room, 2 slices of stale bread and instant coffee, brewed from the kettle I kept hidden. Chewing dry crusts at the edge of my bed, I thought about how much smaller my life had become. Once I planned family meals, roasted chickens, baked Harold's favorite pies. Now I rationed bread like a stranger in a boarding house. My daily survival had turned into a grind early grocery shifts where I bagged food for families who could afford to fill carts, then evening cleaning jobs where the bleach smell clung to my hands. Each night I returned exhausted, my legs aching, only to find laughter echoing from upstairs. Celine's parties never ran out of champagne. My pride throbbed where my bones did quietly, invisibly. Regret kept me company, whispering what I already knew I had given away too much. At the diner where I picked up shifts, the weariness caught up to me. Balancing a tray heavy with coffee cups, I stumbled when my knee gave out slightly. Hot liquid sloshed dangerously, though not a drop spilled. A young waitress snickered. "Careful, Grandma," she muttered, not quite low enough. The words pricked more sharply than the steam. I forced a smile and kept moving jaw tight, refusing to grant her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Inside, though, humiliation burned. My back ached, my eyelids felt weighted, but I straightened myself and kept going. Customers wanted their eggs and bacon, not my weakness. I served, wiped, and cleared, while my body begged for rest. Each plate carried became a reminder Celine lived off my labor while mocking me through her actions. I swallowed my shame the way I swallowed cold coffee, bitter necessary, sustaining only enough to move forward. By late afternoon, I trudged home with sore feet and a bag of discounted groceries. On the sidewalk, Mrs. Caldwell from next door waved. "I saw Celine at the mall earlier," she said cheerfully. "She had bags from Neiman Marcus, looked like she was treating herself. Must be nice." I forced a polite nod, though my chest twisted. So that was where the money went. Designer clothes and perfume while I ate stale bread and counted coins for instant coffee. Mrs. Caldwell meant no harm, but her words drove the knife deeper. Each dollar squeezed from me bought Celine another sparkle, another indulgence. And my son stood by silent. Betrayal pressed down harder than fatigue ever could. That night, in the dim light of my lamp, I opened the little notebook I carried in my purse. My hands shook slightly as I wrote, "Locked out of food." My money buys her champagne. I underlined the words twice. It wasn't much just ink on paper, but it steadied me. For the first time, I thought not of complaining, but of keeping record. Evidence. Proof. My voice could be ignored, twisted, dismissed. But notes, dates, details written in black and white might one day stand taller than my weary body could. I snapped the notebook shut and slid it under my pillow. Tired as I was, something inside me hardened. Quiet doesn't mean powerless. I would keep writing, and one day these words would speak for me. I wrote down the date, and the padlock, not realizing my notes, would one day speak louder than my voice. 2 nights after the padlocked fridge, I dragged myself up the driveway past midnight, the diner's grease still clinging to my uniform. The house looked quiet. Curtains drawn, porch light off. I unlocked the front door softly, not wanting to wake anyone. All I wanted was to fall into bed, but when I reached for my bedroom door, the knob didn't turn. A shiny new lock stared back at me, one I hadn't been given a key for. I tried again, twisting harder, but it held firm. My heart dropped. The one room where I kept my memories of Harold, my husband's watch, and my few private things was shut to me. I stood frozen in the hallway, then turned toward the living room couch. Celine's perfume lingered in the air, a reminder of who controlled the space now. But the couch already had bags thrown across it, her shopping hauls. Defeated. I walked back outside. My old sedan sat waiting, and I slid into the driver's seat. The vinyl squeaked under me as I pulled a blanket from the trunk. The night air was damp, pressing through the cracked window. Curled up in my car, I whispered to no one, "This is my house." But the stars overhead didn't answer. Morning light burned through the windshield. My back screamed as I stretched, but there was no time for self-pity. I stepped inside to find Celine already at the table, sipping coffee from a mug that once belonged to Harold. She didn't look surprised. "We've set new house rules," she said, her voice syrupy with false politeness. "No coming in late, no disrupting our privacy. You can use the couch for now." I turned to Dorian, who leaned against the counter, arms crossed. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. My son. My own flesh and blood stood silent as his wife erased me. I wanted to ask if he remembered who rocked him through fevers, who kept this roof standing after Harold's death. But my lips stayed sealed. Words would only crack me open wider. Humiliation prickled hot along my neck. I nodded once, not trusting myself to speak, and walked past them. My feet carried me to my room's locked door. I rested a hand on the knob, cool and unyielding, before letting go. The silence between me and my son rang louder than Celine's decree. Later that afternoon, I scrubbed floors at one of my regular cleaning jobs, a house far bigger than mine. Exhaustion tugged at my arms, but when I passed by the home office, I paused. A printer hummed quietly, warm from recent use. For the first time, the thought struck me I could copy what I had. I pulled from my tote the crumpled invoice Celine had given me, along with receipts for groceries and a bank slip I'd saved. My hands trembled not from fear, but from the gravity of the act. One by one, I slid them onto the glass. The machine buzzed, spitting out duplicates. I stacked them carefully, marking the dates in my pocket notebook. Invoice, January 12th. Grocery receipt, January 14th. The whir of the printer felt like a drumbeat in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was recording. Paper might last where voices faltered. That evening, I returned home to Celine, standing in the kitchen, swinging a designer handbag by its gold chain. She smiled sweetly, eyes glittering. "Thanks for covering rent, Mom," she said, the words painted as gratitude, but sharpened as cruelty. She knew exactly how they would cut. I met her gaze briefly, then looked away. My mouth stayed closed. Instead, I reached into my tote, opened my notebook, and wrote, "Celine flaunted new bag. Said thanks for rent." I drew a thin line under it. Silence was safer, but ink was permanent. Celine laughed softly, satisfied with her little performance. She thought my quiet was weakness. I let her think it. That night, I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling shadows. My tote bag rested against the side table, stuffed with photocopies and my notebook. My body ached from long shifts, from sleeping in cars and on couches, but my mind stayed sharp. I reached for the bag and brushed the papers with my fingertips. "Paper won't lie when voices do," I whispered into the dark. The words steadied me. I wasn't strong enough to fight openly, not yet, but I could prepare. Each receipt, each note was a seed of something larger. Fear still clung to me, yes, but beneath it pulsed something new, fragile power, cold and deliberate. Paper doesn't tremble, and I promised myself I'd keep every slip, every proof. I came home late in the afternoon, the sun slanting low across the driveway. My hands still smelled of bleach from the morning shift, my bones heavy from hours on my feet. As I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. Dorian was hunched over the island pen, pressed hard against a check. The envelope had my name typed across it, the refund from a utility bill in my name. My name, but not my hand. His strokes were jagged, the M misshapen, the R bent wrong. He didn't see me. I watched his hand glide over the paper, my identity twisted into ink. I said nothing. My lips pressed together as I memorized the date, the amount 6844, and the way his wrist dipped too fast when he finished the E. I etched it into my mind like a photograph. He tore the check free, tucked it into his pocket, and left without a word. I stayed behind, the pen's scratching still echoing in my ears. Betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through forged lines. My chest tightened, but I made myself still. Anger could wait. Watching, remembering that would matter more. That night, I stood before my closet, staring at the fireproof safe Harold and I had tucked away years ago. It had been untouched since his funeral. Dust filmed the handle, but the old brass key still hung from a ribbon at the back of my drawer. I slid it in, twisting, until the lock clicked. The sound rang louder than I expected, like a bell-breaking silence. The safe groaned as I lifted it onto the floor. Inside were neat folders, Harold's handwriting labeling each one. My hands trembled as I pulled out envelopes, insurance policies, bank records, letters he had saved. The scent of paper and metal pulled me backward into nights when he'd sit at this very closet explaining terms I only half understood. Grief tugged at me, but it carried something steadier, to purpose. My breath slowed as I spread the documents across the bed. I wasn't looking at relics anymore. I was looking for answers. Half an hour later, I found them. Buried beneath pension forms lay the revocable living trust signed and notarized, Harold's ink still strong. I flipped through until my eyes caught on the family occupancy agreement stapled to the back. My name, Dorian's name, Celine's name, and clauses spelled out in bold: no party or gathering past 10 p.m., no rent or fees shall be imposed upon Marlene Vale during her lifetime. My eyes stung, but this time with relief, not despair. I wasn't a tenant nor a guest. I was the protected occupant. Their invoices, their padlocks, their laughter at my expense, it all fell apart under the weight of these clauses. I pressed my palm to Harold's signature, steady and sure. He had thought of me even when I didn't know to think of myself. The ground beneath me felt solid for the first time in months. Resolve gathered quietly in my chest. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my pocket notebook and the phone pressed to my ear. I called the county clerk first, asking neutral questions about occupancy agreements, notices, and how one verifies deed restrictions. Then I tried a legal aid clinic downtown, taking careful notes as the paralegal explained timelines, documentation, and the importance of records. Don't act yet, she advised. Keep everything: dates, receipts, copies. When you're ready, procedure will protect you. I wrote in neat bullet points underlining each step. For once, my notes weren't only for survival, they were a roadmap. Knowledge stacked itself inside me like bricks, each answer steadying me more than the last. Fear still lurked, but it no longer ruled. The facts carried me forward one detail at a time. By evening, I had my phone propped up on the dresser, photographing each page of the trust and agreement. I slipped the originals into a manila envelope, sealed it, and wrote one word across the front in block letters: home. Not for them to see, not for show, just for me. The envelope went into a new hiding spot, not back into the safe. When Selene brushed past me in the hall, a handbag swinging from her arm, I offered her a polite nod. Nothing more. Silence wrapped around me, not as weakness, but as shield. She smirked, thinking she had won. I knew better. That night, I opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote Log Day 1. Beneath it, I left the space blank, ready to be filled with evidence yet to come. The quiet in the house pressed close, but my heart beat steady. For the first time, I felt less like prey and more like a witness. I titled the first page, Day 1, then reached for the receipts I'd been saving time to make copies. On my lunch break, I drove to the branch library off Long Point and parked beneath a live oak. I told myself I was just returning a book, but the tote on my shoulder was heavy with envelopes and folded slips. Inside, the copier hummed like a steady heart. I fed in the first invoice, the one with $4,000 printed, bold enough to bruise and press the green button. Light slid beneath the lid, washing my hands in a cold glow. I copied the rent invoices, then the grocery receipts that proved I'd paid for milk and bread, while the fridge stayed padlocked. On each page, I wrote the date in small, careful letters. The repetition steadied me. When the machine jammed a librarian with kind eyes and a silver bob, her badge read, Althea came over with a smile. "Happens to the best of us," she said, clearing the paper with practiced hands. She didn't ask why I needed so many copies, and I didn't tell her. But when she counted my coins and waved off the last quarter, the gesture landed like a hand on my shoulder. I slid my stack into a manila envelope and exhaled for the first time all day. Back home, I set the leather-bound notebook on the kitchen table and opened to a fresh page. Day 2. I wrote at the top, then listed the rent invoice number, the copier date the total charged to me, and the note house still under trust. No rent allowed. I turned the page. Day 3. I recorded the grocery receipt and the fact that the fridge remained locked. I added the time I found the padlock and the code Selene had punched into her phone afterward, 4 quick taps I memorized without meaning to. I wrote down her exact phrasing from last week. Noise before 8 is selfish. Details that had felt like pebbles in my shoe began lining up into a path. The journal smelled faintly of cedar and glue. I smoothed the page, feeling my breathing fall into rhythm with the motion of the pen. I wasn't writing feelings. I was writing facts. Still grief threaded through the numbers. Grief for the home Harold built by picking up extra shifts for the boy I raised to hold doors and tell the truth. I dated the corner, closed the cover, and felt the book grow heavier in my hands, as if it understood the duty I'd given it. That evening, I rinsed my mug and heard a low voice carry from the hall. Selene's phone pressed to her cheek, whispering like a conspirator. "She's just a tenant, not family." She said soft and bright, the same tone she used when ordering champagne. I stood in the kitchen doorway, half-shadowed. Dorian was leaning against the wall, scrolling. He didn't correct her, didn't flinch, didn't look toward me. The word tenant slid under my skin and settled there, colder than the padlock. I pictured the trust in my envelope, the clause that refused her claim, and still the syllables stung. Just a tenant, in my own story. The refrigerator motor clicked on a dull hum, growing until it filled the silence between us. My throat tightened, but my feet stayed rooted. I picked up my mug and left them to their whispering, the way you leave a room that has nothing in it for you anymore. I didn't argue. I set the notebook back on the table, open to day 3, and wrote the sentence exactly as it had been said. She's just a tenant, not family. I circled the word tenant. Once, then twice, then stopped. The letters didn't wobble. My hand was steady. I added the time, the location, the witnesses, the make and model of the phone case she held to her cheek, white marble with a gold ring. It felt clinical, almost cold, but the chill served me. Served. Heat had never helped me in this house. Heat got mocked, dismissed, turned back on me as oversensitive. Paper, on the other hand, could not be coaxed into lying. I pressed the page flat and listened to my breath even out. In the living room, a sitcom laugh track rose and fell. I let it be background noise. My life had stopped running on their volume controls. Each line I wrote reclaimed a little square of ground no one could rent back to me. After dark, I carried the envelope of copies and the journal to the garage. I lifted the trunk, pulled up the false bottom, and slid the bundle into the lockable compartment beside Harold's tire iron and a folded roadside blanket. The click of the lock sounded small, but it traveled through me like an oath. I lowered the liner, shut the trunk, and wiped my palms on my jeans. When I looked back at the house, a light burned in the upstairs window. Celine's laugh floated out high and unbothered. I stood in the driveway and counted to 10 the way I'd taught Dorian when he was little, and angry about nothing back when timeouts were about learning to breathe and not about being banished from your own refrigerator. I spoke into the quiet just loud enough for me I'll let paper carry my voice. Then I went inside, placed the notebook's cheaper twin on my nightstand for decoy, and slept with my keys under the pillow. I whispered to myself, "Paper carries truth, not knowing how soon I'd need it." The morning air in the kitchen smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and something darker, a bitter note I couldn't place until I lifted the trash lid. Ash lay in thin curls like burned flower petals. I pinched a fragment and turned it toward the light. The char line cut through the store logo, and beneath the soot, I could still make out the date I'd written in the corner. One of my receipts reduced to black lace. My skin prickled. I sifted gently, found another scrap with the ghost of a subtotal, then a corner of my handwriting. Fire in my house on my paper. Not an accident. Someone had reached into my drawer, taken what wasn't theirs, and fed it to a flame as if truth were tinder. The room tilted not from weakness, but from recognition. Erasure is never loud. It begins with small, careless burns. Celine breezed in with her coffee, the color of melted caramel sunglasses perched in her hair, though we were indoors. "I went through some clutter," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. "Old papers. We need to keep the counters clear." She dropped a packet of collagen powder into her cup, shook the packet like a tiny flag of victory, and smiled over the rim. I looked at my son. Dorian studied the weather app as if Houston's humidity were breaking news. He didn't ask what had burned. He didn't look at the trash. Silence, a trick he'd learned too well, stretched between us like shrink wrap. I felt the old reflex rise in me, the one that wants to explain, justify, beg for a reasonable middle. I swallowed it. "Counters are clear," I said, and set the lid down very gently, the way a nurse sets down a chart after reading something she already knew but hoped wasn't true. 2 nights earlier, anticipating a day like this, I had placed a thumb-sized camera beneath the lip of my desk drawer. It wasn't much, $30 and a long charge, but it watched without blinking. After breakfast, I took my phone to the laundry room, shut the door, and opened the app. The timeline showed a thin vein of blue where movement had been recorded. I dragged my finger and watched yesterday unfold in a silent play. Their manicured hand-pale polish. The drawer eased open. Celine's face appeared in profile, serene as a hostess, as she leafed through my envelopes with a practiced thumb. She selected a receipt, checked the hallway, then slipped it into her pocket. Another clipped the garage door. A candle jar on the workbench, a flick of a lighter, the receipt curling into itself like a dry leaf. She blew it to ash and swept the remains into a grocery bag before carrying it inside. I watched the same hand stir collagen into coffee this morning. Fear drained out of me like bathwater. In its place, something steadier settled confirmation. I saved the files 3 angles each, clear enough to show the gold band she wore and the tiny birthmark on her wrist. I copied them to a flash drive, labeled it with a strip of masking tape. Kitchen 6:22 a.m., drawer 6:17 a.m., garage 6:20 a.m., and slid it into a small case with my phone charger. Then I took the case to the car and locked it in the compartment beneath the trunk liner next to the envelope that held the trust and the occupancy agreement. On my way back in, I paused by the rosemary plant Harold and I had put in a terracotta pot the first spring we lived here. I rubbed a sprig between my fingers until the resin clung to my skin. Memory is like that. You touch the right leaf and the scent refuses to leave. At lunch, I opened my journal on the patio and printed the heading in block letters, Day 6, caught her hand in the fire. Below it, I wrote the times from the footage, the path she took, the items burned. I noted my observation of the trash at 6:41 a.m., the presence of the candle jar and the brand of lighter pink with a floral sticker. I added the breakfast exchange, verbatim old papers. We need to keep the counters clear. When I finished, I underlined the page number and flipped back through prior entries. The book now read like a spine receipts, quotes, dates all the small bones that would hold the body of what came next upright. I closed the cover and felt the faint warmth where my hand had rested. Evidence warms differently than anger. It radiates from inside out. By mid-afternoon, I was vacuuming a ranch house off Memorial for a couple who traveled more than they stayed put. The house smelled like lemon oil and absinthe. I moved slowly, line by line, the vacuum tracks combing the rug into neat fields. As I worked, the panic that had flashed through me in the kitchen thinned into a cleaner, simpler thread. Celine hadn't just tried to destroy a receipt. She had signed her name to my story with heat. She had confirmed what she would deny with words by the honesty of her actions. My phone buzzed in my apron. A message from the library: flash drives are half off this week, FYI. Althea must have remembered the coins I fed into the copier. I texted back a thank you. The vacuum hummed, and for the first time in weeks, my shoulders dropped. I finished the shift and sat in my car, the late sun flattening the tops of the pines into gold plates. I unlocked the trunk compartment and checked the flash drive's little case like a parent peeking on a sleeping child. Still there. I added a second drive I'd bought at lunch and mirrored the files. 2 copies, 2 hiding places. I locked the compartment, slid behind the wheel, and rested my palms at 10 and 2. She thinks she erased me, I said into the quiet. She only confirmed herself. The steering wheel was warm. I pictured the ash in the kitchen trash and felt no need to dig through it again. Ash tells you only that something burned. Video tells you who lit the match. On the way to my night shift, I stopped at the gas station where Harold used to buy scratch-offs, not for the lottery, but for the silly thrill of silver dust. I went inside for a coffee and a pack of sticky notes. Back in the car, I wrote a single line on the top note and pressed it to my dashboard where I'd see it before I walked in anywhere. Silence is strategy, not surrender. The line steadied my breath as I pulled onto the frontage road. I didn't need to storm the kitchen or wave the flash drive in anyone's face. I needed to keep stacking truth quietly until it cast its own shadow. By the time I parked behind the diner, the sky had turned the deep blue that makes neon look honest. I tied on my apron, tucked my phone into the pocket, and touched the flash drive case through the fabric of my bag just once, the way you touch a locket. Inside, plates clattered, and someone laughed too loudly at a joke that didn't deserve it. I moved through the motions, coffee topped off orders called napkins, folded aware of a new layer beneath my steps. It wasn't bravado, it was ballast. Fire had licked the edge of my life this morning and failed to swallow it. Paper would hold, pixels would hold, I would hold. She thought fire erased me. Instead, it carved her signature into my evidence. The kitchen smelled faintly of garlic and rosemary when I came in from my shift. Dorian stood at the counter, his shoulders bent just slightly forward, his pen moving across a stack of papers Celine had laid out in front of him. She leaned one hip against the counter, her nails tapping in rhythm with his signature. He didn't glance at me, didn't glance at the words he was signing, just looped his name as though the lines were nothing but waiting blanks. Initial here, too, Celine said lightly, sliding another page forward. He obeyed without looking. The sound of the pen dragging across the page was sharper than any insult. My throat tightened. I stepped closer enough to see the bold font at the top, agreement, but not enough to read the smaller text. My son didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask why. He simply trusted the hand that pushed the page, not the one that had raised him. I moved to the sink, rinsing lettuce under cold water, willing my breathing into rhythm. Every drop that splashed on my skin felt heavier than it should have. I told myself not to imagine what those papers meant, but dread has its own way of writing in the body, even when you look away. By evening, the table was set. I'd roasted chicken, baked a pan of scalloped potatoes, sliced bread warm enough to steam when torn. Food had always been my way to keep the edges of family from fraying a hope that maybe flavor could stitch together what words could not. Celine had invited a friend, a woman with a polished laugh and earrings that caught the light. I didn't ask her name. I simply pulled out a chair and said, "Dinner's ready." The plates passed, the wine poured. I watched my son lift his fork, eat quietly, as if we were in a restaurant instead of his mother's kitchen. For a fragile moment, I thought perhaps this meal might smooth something. The rhythm of knives against plates, the hum of small talk, it almost felt familiar, almost safe. Then Celine tilted her glass and said, "You know, tenants really shouldn't complain about utilities. It comes with the territory." Her friend laughed too quickly. Even Dorian's lips twitched, though he kept his gaze on his plate. The joke wasn't clever, not even sharp, but it cut like glass. The word lodged in me tenant, not mother, not Marlene, tenant. I set my fork down gently. My hand didn't shake, though my insides folded in on themselves. The laugh of strangers echoed in my kitchen, and my son let it happen. He let me sit there carved out of my own home. I excused myself to clear plates no one had finished. The sink water scalded my hands, but I welcomed the sting. It gave me something to feel other than the hollow expanding in my chest. Behind me, Celine's voice carried light as Lace Dorian's quiet chuckle woven through it. That sound hurt more than any insult. By the time the dishes dried, the table was empty. Chairs pushed back, glasses half drained. I wiped the counter, folded the dish towel, and sat at the table alone. The papers from earlier flickered across my mind, the curve of his signature, his eyes never lifting. I understood then erasure doesn't always come as shouting. Sometimes it comes as silence, as the absence of defense, as your child's faint smile at another's cruelty. That night, I opened my leather-bound notebook and wrote, "Dinner, tenant, son silent." The words sat black and steady on the page. I turned back to the memory of the papers and noted unknown agreements signed. Date March 3rd. Then I underlined a single sentence: "I am no longer mother here, but I will not be erased." The ink sank into the page with finality. Outside the house was quiet except for distant laughter from upstairs. I closed the journal, slid it beneath my pillow, and lay down. The word tenant still rang in my ears, but the page beneath me held something stronger, a refusal. I wrote the word erased in ink, not realizing Celine's next move would try to make it permanent. Celine waited for me that evening, the kitchen lit as if staged. She sat at the table with a stack of papers, neatly fanned out, her nails clicking against the top sheet. "We've decided to formalize things," she said, sliding the document toward me. Dorian stood behind her, arms crossed but eyes lowered. My gaze dropped to the page. Lease agreement. The date placed it months earlier, long before Celine and I ever discussed rent. At the bottom, in a flourish meant to mimic my hand, sat my own name, my signature stolen and bent. For a moment, the room tilted. "That's not mine," I whispered. Celine's smiled lips painted the same shade of red as the lawyer ads plastered along I-45. Even tenants should respect contracts. She tapped the signature line. "It's all right here." Dorian shifted, but he didn't look at me. His silence was louder than any insult. I steadied my voice. "Then give me a copy." Her smirk widened. "Copies can be dangerous, Marlene. You'll just have to trust us." She gathered the papers in a stack and patted them like they were already law. I walked away without another word. My stomach was hollow, my throat raw. Upstairs, I opened my journal and wrote 3 words across a fresh page: lease, forged, erased. The pen pressed deep into the paper, almost tearing it. I stared at the lines until they blurred. Fear crept close, fear that she could take not only the house, but the story of my life inside it. But I would not let ink made by her hand decide my place. The next day, I found myself at the library again. My tote was heavy with receipts and invoices. I fed papers into the scanner one by one, aligning corners with patient care. Althea the librarian with kind eyes passed by and paused. "You're back," she said softly. I nodded, making sure I don't lose what little I've kept. She tilted her head. "Your husband's name was Harold Morley, wasn't it?" The sound of his name caught me off guard. I looked up. "Yes." Althea tapped her finger against her chin. "I used to help with deed filings here years ago. Harold left records, archived copies. They should still be on microfiche." My heart stumbled in my chest. She disappeared into the back, returning with a small square of film and an old reader machine wheeled on a cart. She fed the film through, adjusted the lens, and there it was a copy of the deed Harold's name mine and a stamped occupancy agreement. A record immune to Seleni's fire, a truth untouched by her arrogance. "Can I get a copy?" My voice cracked. Althea smiled, printing the image onto thick paper. "These don't burn so easy." I held the page with trembling hands. Relief washed through me, followed by something sharper. Steadier resolve. That night back in my room, I slid the copy into my envelope marked home. I whispered to the silence. Ink fades, paper burns, but records outlive liars. Outside the window, Seleni's laughter rose from the patio. She thought her lease was enough to erase me. She didn't know I carried something stronger, proof no fire could destroy. I closed the envelope, pressed it flat, and slid it into the tote where my journal and flash drive waited. The evidence was no longer scraps of paper. It was a shield piece by piece against the storm she thought she owned. The first thing I saw when I opened the door at dawn was orange. A sheet of paper flapped against the glass, taped unevenly at the corners. I peeled it free and read the bold words, "Eviction Notice." My name was spelled wrong. Marlene and the statute cited didn't match anything I'd seen in my calls with legal aid. No court stamp, no clerk seal, just photocopied language meant to scare. I turned it over. The back was blank. My stomach clenched, but my hands didn't shake. I laid the page flat on the counter, took photos front and back, then held my phone close so the flash caught the crooked tape mark still stuck to the doorframe. Proof of their performance. I brewed coffee and sat at the table with Harold's old notebook. One column for lies, another for facts. First fact, the county clerk had already told me what a real notice looked like. Second fact, this wasn't it. I dialed the intake line again, asked the clerk to confirm, and wrote each answer down. A landlord or owner must post a proper notice to vacate, with date, reason, and time frame, the woman said. No signature, no court file. It's just paper. She reminded me of the requirements delivery method clear deadline documentation. I underlined each word. My breath steadied. Fear shrank when replaced with procedure. By noon, I had my own papers spread across the kitchen table. I typed the notice to vacate exactly as the occupancy agreement allowed 30 days, citing breach of family terms, signed in ink with today's date. I made copies, stamped each page, and placed one in an envelope for certified mail. Outside, I taped the official notice square to the front door. My phone camera caught the timestamp the way the paper sat flush without crooked tape. Across the street, Mrs. Navarro stood watering her plants. She paused, lifted a hand in a small wave, then looked away. A silent witness, but a witness nonetheless. I breathed in the dry Houston air and felt a shift. The boundary was mine to draw, and I had just drawn it. That evening, an email popped into my inbox from an address that looked half-made Houston property, managers.outlook.com. The subject line read, "Urgent fines due." Inside the message threatened lock changes, late fees, and property manager authority. The grammar was sloppy, the tone exaggerated. I printed it immediately, noting the spoofed domain. Selene hadn't even tried to hide her hand. I didn't reply. I didn't forward. I archived the message, slipped the printout into my evidence folder, and wrote in the margin, "Fake property manager email, March 9th. Silence again became my defense. By nightfall, my tote was heavier. Inside sat a folder labeled Notice Sequence Photos of the fake orange paper, my official notice. the certified mail receipt, the occupancy clause, and the email. Each piece lined up like bricks in a wall. The clerk's voice still rang in my ears. File at the county court for a hearing date. So I drove downtown, stood in line under humming lights, and handed over the stack. The clerk stamped it and said, "You'll receive your date by phone." When I got home, I slipped Harold's old watch onto my wrist. The band was worn, the face scratched, but it ticked steady against my pulse. It felt like a promise: show up, be on time, don't falter. I looked at the empty hallway, the closed door where my son and his wife whispered, "Let them." I had my own calendar now. When the hearing date hit my phone, I set 2 alarms and pressed the watch. Harold left me flat against my pulse. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and disinfectant. I arrived early, Harold's old watch snug on my wrist, the folder marked "Home" pressed to my chest. Metal detectors hummed and the deputy waved me through. I rode the elevator with strangers whose eyes never met mine, each of us carrying our own battles in manila envelopes. When the judge called the docket, I took my seat at the petitioner's table. Celine swept in, late heels striking sharp against the tile lips, curved in a confident smile. Dorian trailed behind her shoulders, slouched eyes fixed on the floor. The bailiff called silence, and the hearing began. Celine wasted no time. She placed her so-called lease before the judge, declaring me a tenant who refused to follow rules. She spoke of chronic violations, unpaid rent, and disruptions. The document looked official at a glance, but as the judge examined it, details unraveled dates that didn't align a notary stamp without verification, my signature looping in a style I never used. I didn't raise my voice. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "I request this exhibit be marked, and I'll reserve my response until after my own evidence." The judge nodded, tapping the paper once with his pen. Celine smirked as if sure her performance had landed. When it was my turn, I rose slowly and opened my folder. I placed each document in order: the revocable living trust deed, the family occupancy agreement with clauses forbidding rent charges, and late-night parties photos of my properly posted notice to vacate with visible timestamps, certified mail receipts, and finally the printed email from the so-called property manager address. I slid forward my pocket notebook pages, dated and initialed in my handwriting, showing entries as each event unfolded. "This is the record of my life under their roof," I told the court. "Not written in anger, just dates, times, receipts." The judge leafed through, pausing at the forged lease, then at my certified mail slips. Celine shifted in her chair, tapping her nails again, this time with less rhythm. Then came the witnesses. Betty, my neighbor of 15 years, stood and raised her hand for the oath. She testified that she had watched me tape. The notice to the door had heard the late-night parties more than once, and knew I had lived continuously in the house since Harold's death. Her voice never wavered. Next, Calvin from the HOA board stepped forward. He brought records fines addressed to the trust warnings issued for noise violations and confirmation that ownership never left the trust's control. "This property has always been associated with Mrs. Morley," he said firmly. "Not as a tenant, but as an occupant under the trust." The judge nodded, entered both testimonies into the record, and held up Celine's lease one last time. "There are indicia of forgery here," he said flatly, "and no credible evidence of a property management authority. The trust and occupancy agreement are clear." Celine tried to interject, but her words tangled in her throat. Dorian's head hung lower. The judge continued, "The respondent retains her right of possession. Petitioners are ordered to vacate by the stated deadline. Failure to comply will result in a writ of possession." I didn't smile. I didn't glance at Celine. I simply gathered my folder, slid Harold's watch back under my sleeve, and exhaled slowly. Dignity wasn't about winning. It was about standing steady when others expected you to fall. As the judge finished speaking, Celine's voice pitched higher, and the bailiff raised a hand for quiet. The gavel had barely stopped echoing when I closed my folder and drew a steady breath. Relief hummed through my chest like a low current. The judge's words still lingered, recognition of my rights, the order for them to vacate. I pressed Harold's watch against my wrist, grounding myself in its weight. For one small moment, I allowed myself to feel safe. Then the air shifted. Celine shifted too, her face blotched red, her lips twitching. I knew that look. The silence before the storm was sometimes louder than the thunder itself. Without warning, she shot to her feet. "This is my house!" she screamed, voice shrill enough to rattle the glass behind the bench. Her words bounced off the wooden panels, sharp and wild. Dorian reached for her sleeve, murmuring her name, but she shook him off violently. The bailiff moved closer, hand raised in warning. The judge pounded his gavel once, twice the sound cutting through the chaos. Still, she raged, her voice cracking. "I carried every bill I paid for everything with her money anyway. You think she deserves to live there? She's nothing but." The words tangled, but the meaning was clear. Gasps rippled across the gallery benches. Even Dorian froze his hand, hanging limp between them. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Let the record reflect the respondent's statement," he said firmly. The clerk scribbled notes. My folder felt heavier in my hands, but not with fear. Vindication pulsed instead, sharp and clean. She had admitted it herself, her lifestyle funded by me, her so-called authority, nothing more than theft, wrapped in arrogance. Celine's chest heaved, her voice breaking. The bailiff stepped in, guiding her back toward her chair as she tried to spit more words into the air. "Enough!" the judge snapped. "One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt." He turned to her squarely. "You are fined for disruption. Enforcement of my order will proceed on schedule." She glared, eyes, glassy lips tight. Dorian stared at the floor, shoulders caving in. The courtroom exhaled as though everyone had been holding their breath. Order settled like dust after a collapse. I gathered my things, standing tall. Betty appeared at my side, warm hand on my arm. Calvin from the HOA gave me a small nod of approval as I passed. The corridor outside smelled of stale coffee and freedom. As I walked toward the exit, Harold's watch felt steady against my pulse. I whispered to myself so softly no one could hear. Her outburst was confession enough. Her shouting still rang in my ears as I unlocked my car, but the date to vacate was circled in red on my calendar. The morning light spilled across the driveway, soft but unyielding. The sheriff's cruiser pulled in right on time, the low rumble of its engine vibrating through my chest. Clipboard in hand, he stepped out, boots crunching the gravel. I stood waiting on the porch. Harold's watch snug around my wrist, my folder pressed flat against my side. The curtains inside twitched, Celine's shadow pacing. Dorian's car sat crooked in the drive, one door slightly ajar as if even it had grown restless from the tension. My breath came steady, though every muscle hummed with anticipation. The sheriff knocked with a firm hand. "Deadline's here," he announced. Celine swung the door open before I could move the fake lease already in her fist. "This paper proves it's ours," she shouted, shaking it like a flag. The sheriff barely glanced at it. "Judge already ruled on this." "It's invalid," he said, voice-clipped, professional. Celine sputtered, demanding he look again, but the words fell flat. Behind her, Dorian bent over boxes, quietly folding shirts, eyes never lifting. His silence cut deeper than her shrieking ever could. The standoff snapped when Celine tried one last play. Her voice cracked as she shifted from begging to rage, accusing me of ruining her life. "You took everything from me?" she cried, tugging at the legs of a dining chair. The sheriff blocked her path, one hand raised. "This furniture is listed under the trust. You're not taking it." Neighbors had gathered by then, whispers rolling across the street like wind through leaves. Faces peered from porches and driveways, watching Celine's fury dissolve into humiliation. My heart should have leapt, but instead it settled heavy and calm. By noon, the house echoed. Movers carried the last of their boxes down the steps, each thud against the porch boards, reverberating through me like a drumbeat of closure. I sat at the kitchen table, folder beside me. The room smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish, the way it had when Harold and I first signed the mortgage papers here decades ago. I remembered his laugh filling this space, his pride when we hung curtains for the first time. For a moment, grief pressed in, but it was tempered now, woven into something steadier, something that held me up instead of breaking me down. As the sun lowered across the neighborhood, I locked the door behind me. The house exhaled in the silence walls, no longer pressed by arguments or slammed doors. On the porch, I whispered, "This house breathes again." My phone buzzed Betty inviting me to dinner. I smiled a small, tired smile and texted back, "Yes." For the first time in years, I walked into my house and felt it was mine again, silent, steady, and safe. Looking back, I realized silence was never weakness, it was preparation. I learned that protecting what you built with patience and proof is a kind of love for yourself and for the generations that follow. My story is not only about eviction, it's about reclaiming dignity when others try to write you out of your own life. Maybe you've faced betrayal too, by family, by friends, by those you trusted most. What would you have done in my place? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 below or let me know where you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Together, we keep these voices alive.